Did you know that some of the most impactful elections in American history were decided by seemingly impossible margins? Think of Abraham Lincoln, a leader who, at the height of the Civil War, faced such a deep crisis that he himself believed he would lose. And yet, he became a symbol of resistance and determination. Now imagine what this reveals about the political landscape of that time, and how it resonates in our current political world. Let's start with 1864. Lincoln versus McClellan. The future of the country was at stake. On one side, Lincoln fighting to preserve the Union and end slavery. On the other, McClellan, a military commander who, despite being from the same party, had a radically different vision for how to conduct the war. McClellan was not aligned with Lincoln's goal of abolishing slavery, he just wanted to end the war. This division within the Democratic Party reflected the political tensions of the time. Lincoln won decisively, taking 55.1% of the popular vote and 212 electoral votes, but his victory wasn't certain until the very end. For much of 1864, many believed he would lose. But support for his re-election grew as military victories began to turn the tide, showing how the war situation was intrinsically tied to the political landscape. Now, think of today's political polarization. Like Lincoln's victory, many elections today are shaped by internal divisions within the parties themselves and by external forces that ultimately influence the outcome. In Lincoln's case, radical Republican support solidified as he turned the tide of the war. However, Democrats remained divided. McClellan won only 3 states, including his home state of New Jersey and Kentucky, Lincoln's birthplace. A lackluster victory, but one that reflected resistance in certain states. Let's move to another historic election, 1804, Thomas Jefferson against Charles Pinckney. Jefferson, who had defeated John Adams 4 years earlier in a close contest, now found himself immensely popular, with 73.2% of the popular vote. His re-election was almost a walk in the park. The Louisiana Purchase and successful foreign policy made him an icon, while the Federalists, weakened by the death of Alexander Hamilton, could barely present a convincing alternative. What does this say about today's political dynamics? A leader's popularity, like Jefferson's, can transform the electoral landscape. But more importantly, the weakening of the opposition, whether through internal divisions or significant losses, can pave the way for crushing victories. At the time, the 2 states Pinckney won were Delaware and Connecticut, known for their strong support of the Federalists. This reminds us how elections can be decided in specific territories, where local political culture strongly influences the outcome. And in 1972, the election of Richard Nixon against George McGovern was one of the most lopsided in history. Nixon won with 520 electoral votes, taking 49 states, compared to just 17 for McGovern. With 60.7% of the popular vote, Nixon seemed unstoppable. But what really defined this election? McGovern, a candidate seen as a more progressive alternative, failed to convince the American electorate to align with his proposals. This scenario of a crushing victory, even when the winner has a questionable electoral history, is something that makes us reflect on how elections can be shaped by unpredictable factors. Nixon, a man with a controversial history, navigated a series of electoral victories that ultimately proved decisive. Today, in such a polarized election environment, do voters have the same perception of candidates? Richard Nixon's story is a political roller coaster. In 1960, he lost to John F. Kennedy but came back strong in 1968, winning the presidency. However, his re-election in 1972 was a completely different game. Nixon had restored the economy during his first term and established an image of strong international leadership, especially with his actions abroad. But what really secured his landslide victory in 1972 was the failure of the opposition. As the far right and far left tried to challenge him, they failed to mount an effective opposition. And the Democratic Party, still in ruin since 1968, was divided into factions. In the end, the party chose George McGovern, a candidate who was far from being the ideal choice. McGovern was not widely known and could not captivate the traditional Democratic base. His campaign was full of internal failures, and his radical left stance further alienated moderate voters. Nixon knew how to capitalize on this and turned what could have been a close race into a landslide victory. McGovern, with all his weaknesses, barely managed to win his own state, South Dakota, and was defeated in all other states. The only state McGovern managed to win was Massachusetts, a Democratic stronghold since 1960. Nixon's victory was historic. He became the first Republican to win the South, a feat few had predicted, and entered history as one of only 3 candidates to win more than 500 electoral votes. This victory was not just a reflection of Nixon's strength, but also of the disorganization within the Democratic Party, which failed to build a solid base and a competitive candidate. Today, looking at our politics, we see a similar scenario of polarization and party weakness, where the lack of a unified opposition can define the election. Now let's jump to 1984, an election that played out in a very similar way in terms of surprises and outcomes. Ronald Reagan, the charismatic former actor, seemed to be in crisis in the middle of his first term. The economy was in recession, and his approval ratings were falling. At many points, it seemed he wouldn't even have the strength to win his re-election, let alone secure a landslide victory. But what happened was something analysts didn't predict. The economy recovered, and Americans began to see Reagan in a renewed light. Reagan's optimism, his message of a prosperous and secure future, resonated with voters. Meanwhile, his opponent, Walter Mondale, had the difficult task of competing against the popular president. Mondale, former vice president under Jimmy Carter, had lost with Carter in the 1980 election, and his message of improving relations with the Soviet Union and raising taxes simply didn't resonate with the public. Mondale's lack of charisma was even more evident when compared to Reagan's presence, who always seemed at ease, whether on the political stage or in front of the cameras. Like Nixon in 1972, Reagan not only won the election, but defeated Mondale in a landslide. Reagan took 49 states, losing only Minnesota, Mondale's home state. His victory was not only a reaffirmation of his personal popularity, but also a reflection of the voters' distance from Mondale's proposals, which failed to convince the public that he was the change the country needed. These 2 historic victories, Nixon in 1972 and Reagan in 1984, have something in common. They not only reflect the strength of the candidates, but also the fragility and lack of cohesion in the opposition. The defeats of McGovern and Mondale were not just a matter of electoral numbers, but a reflection of strategic failures and internal divisions that paralyzed their respective parties. In times of crisis or uncertainty, voters seek stability and confidence, and when the opposition fails to present a viable alternative, the path is open for a landslide victory. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 was a milestone in American politics, and his overwhelming victory against Jimmy Carter is often seen as a reflection of public dissatisfaction with the economy and the global situation. However, many forget that, despite Carter's crushing defeat, Reagan won the popular vote by a relatively narrow margin, gaining just over 10 percentage points. And in 1984, when Reagan secured re-election, he didn't just win, he destroyed the opposition. Walter Mondale, his opponent, barely managed to win one state, Minnesota, his home state. Reagan swept 49 of 50 states and captured the majority of electoral votes, securing 525, a feat that has been repeated only a few times in history. What made Reagan's victory even more impressive was the context. In 1980, he wasn't a conventional political figure. He was a former actor with an optimistic vision for a better future for the United States, a message that deeply resonated with voters. But unlike 1972, when Nixon won with a more pragmatic strategy, Reagan was a candidate who made voters believe a better America was within their reach. The economic recovery, military strength, and trust in his leadership helped shape his re-election into one of the most decisive electoral victories in history. This brings us to 1936, when Franklin D. Roosevelt faced Alf Landon in an election that is still remembered as one of the most landslide victories of all time. Roosevelt received 523 electoral votes, while Landon only 8. Roosevelt won 46 of the 48 states in the Union, leaving Landon with a pitiful presence on the electoral map. But what makes this election so fascinating is the political context of the time. The Great Depression was still ongoing, and many Americans were betting on New Deal programs like Social Security and unemployment benefits to get through the crisis. Landon, on the other hand, was no match for Roosevelt. Compared to the charismatic Roosevelt, who knew how to connect with the masses, Landon was a timid candidate, absent at key moments of the campaign, and lacked a strong alternative to the New Deal. His attempt to simply criticize the Roosevelt administration without presenting a viable alternative wasn't enough to captivate voters. He even lost his home state, Kansas, by a significant margin. It's fascinating to observe that this election, which became a classic example of a landslide victory, took place in a time when the country was in the midst of a devastating economic crisis, but also during a period when Roosevelt's government had begun to implement policies that ultimately changed the lives of millions of Americans. And just like Nixon's and Reagan's elections, Roosevelt's 1936 victory wasn't just a reflection of the strength of his government, but also the weakness of his opposition, which was unable to unite or offer a convincing alternative. If we go back a bit further in time, we reach 1964, when Lyndon Johnson defeated Barry Goldwater in an overwhelming victory. Johnson captured 61.1% of the popular vote, which at the time was a historical record. His victory is notable not only for the size of his margin, but for the impact it had on American politics. Johnson assumed the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy and carried forward the progressive policies of the Great Society, which aimed to fight poverty and ensure civil rights for African Americans. Johnson's victory was a response to the growing fear of the Cold War and Goldwater's radicalism, which advocated a much more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. These historical victories, from Roosevelt to Johnson, Nixon to Reagan, show us that the political landscape of each era shapes the electoral dynamics. What unites these events is not just the number of votes, but the power of internal divisions and the difficulties of the opposition. In today's elections, are we seeing a mirror of these same tensions? Parties fracturing, campaigns shaped by issues that may be more urgent for voters than ever before. Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory in 1964 wasn't just a confirmation of his government's popularity, but also a manifestation of the turbulent times in which we lived. The assassination of John F. Kennedy had left the nation in mourning, and Johnson was seen as the natural successor, offering continuity to the slain president's legacy. But more than that, Johnson embraced the cause of civil rights with a passion that resonated deeply with a divided nation. He didn't just defeat Barry Goldwater, he overwhelmingly rejected the conservative vision that Goldwater represented, especially with regard to the Cold War and African American rights. Johnson's victory was seen as a plebiscite on the need for social and economic change, but also a reaction to the fear that Goldwater himself had fueled with his support for military escalation against the Soviet Union. Johnson won all the states, except for those in the Deep South and Arizona, Goldwater's home state. This clearly reflects the resistance of the more conservative areas of the country, which still opposed changes to the social order. Even so, Johnson's victory was overwhelming, showing that the ideals of progress and social justice were on the rise. In contrast, in 1820, James Monroe achieved a virtually unanimous victory. The Federalist Party, which still existed, was on its last legs, unable to rally a strong candidate. Monroe won without real opposition, the only exception being an unfaithful elector who voted for Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who wasn't even running. It was a victory that nearly bordered on total consensus and a milestone in a period of great stability in American politics, when the war for independence was behind us and the nation was beginning to grow. Monroe's victory took place in a very different context, but it is still fascinating to see how the country, at that time, was still dominated by a fragile two-party system, with the Federalist Party practically disappearing from the political scene. The real political strength lay in Monroe's figure and in the sense of national unity that prevailed, but perhaps the most iconic of the massive victories was George Washington's. In 1788 and 1792, Washington was elected president unanimously, a feat that is nearly impossible to imagine today. The electoral rules of the time meant that the second-place candidate became vice president, and in practice, Washington had no rivals. He was beloved in all states for his leadership during the Revolutionary War, and there really was no other name that could challenge his status as a national hero. Benjamin Franklin, who could have been a rival, did not run for president but strongly supported Washington, further solidifying the popularity of the first president of the United States. These historic victories, from Johnson to Monroe, from Washington to Roosevelt, reveal how American politics has always been a constant battle of ideals, and how the figures who led the country during times of crisis and change became icons of their eras. In every election, whether it's Nixon or Reagan, we see not just the fight for an office, but the fight for a vision of the future. Who aligns with what? Which ideals will prevail at the polls? These are the questions that ultimately define the stories of these great electoral victories. If you enjoyed this dive into the history of U.S. presidential elections, be sure to explore the channel for more videos on the trajectory of presidents, their decisions, controversies, and the impact they had on the course of American history.